Thanks, Professor Woolley. I would like to thank you all for coming here to the library at Fairleigh Dickinson, Madison, and to the final lecture of the Politics on the Public Mind series. My name is Daniel Palmer, and I am a sophomore political science major here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Today I'll be introducing to you Dr. Jeremy Teigen. Dr. Teigen is an associate professor of political science at Ramapo College in New Jersey, where he also serves as the chair of the department. He researches and teaches American politics, specifically elections, voting behavior, voter turnout, and military service. He received his bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin, majoring in political science and English literature. He then went on to receive his master's and PhD from the University of Texas in government. He is published in Political Research Quarterly, Political Communication, Armed Forces and Society, European Security, and Social Science Quarterly. If you go on to the Ramapo College website, you'll find Gerryminder, a redistricting simulation developed by Dr. Teigen and Jeremy A. Gilbertson. It is a free, online redistricting simulation designed for undergraduates to learn about congressional elections, representation, and gerrymandering. The point of the simulation is to put students in a position to manipulate district lines themselves with a measure of fairness, and also provide a non-boring, experimental way to teach redistricting. Today he will be speaking on New Jersey suburban voting, specifically how density, distance, and commuting influence elections. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jeremy Teigen.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that introduction, and I want to say thank you to Peter for the invitation and Colleen for helping make it easy to get down here. I also want to thank my dean, Hassan Najad, who helped me with funding to pay for some research assistance that helped me piece together what you see is a rather wide array of New Jersey municipal level data that made this analysis possible. So I have Tom McGady and Justine D'Elia and Christine Copps here, 3 undergrads at Ramapo, who really helped forge together the empirical data that made this possible. And I want to thank you for coming. I've never heard that lingo before, Peter, the regularly matriculated and differently matriculated. So both populations together, I want to thank you for coming here. And I presume giving up your opportunity to see a royal wedding because you're not getting in now if you're here today. So I assume you've missed that boat, so I appreciate you making that sacrifice. And joining this opportunity that for me to share my research, and I know it's the end of the semester too, and I'm sure you students have lots of things to accomplish, so I'm glad you guys could all make it. So let me tell you about my purpose here with this research project. I hope to, with this, to unpack the relationship between place and politics, where we live and how that shapes how we vote. I want to do this for New Jersey because this is where we live, and this is the case where I've lived since 2005. But that doesn't mean it's New Jersey specific or unique to New Jersey. I think New Jersey just makes a very good case for understanding suburbia elsewhere. New Jersey represents a relatively old set of suburbs when you're talking about the relationship between suburbs and the urban center. And so, as I'll talk about a little later, I think it's important that future tangents of this research explore these same dynamics, but in much newer suburbs. For example, imagine Houston or Phoenix or Los Angeles or newer suburban growth and sprawl. So how large and what are the politics of the suburbs? Suburbia has grown by any measure tremendously since the mid-20th century, going from about the Eisenhower era from about a third of the electorate to today where about half, depending on whether you're looking at exit polls or how the Census Bureau counts, to now a little bit more than half of the electorate live in the suburban areas. And to me, that is an immediate prima facie case for understanding its importance. So if we want to know how suburbia votes, what we're essentially asking is how half of us behave politically on election day. So how do we assess the politics of suburbia? It's a bit of a tricky question. It's not as simple as you hear about when you're watching election night coverage and listening to the talking heads on television talk about exit poll results who say, well, the urban vote was this way, the suburban vote was this way, and the rural vote was this way. And that's part of my methodological and measurement frustration that inspired this study, is getting to understand a better way of appreciating both the measurement and political contextualization of suburbs. We could poll people individually and ask people through some kind of randomized process, look at how they behave and call them up with random digit dialing, or find them in a different way and ask them how they vote. We can look at voting patterns in places. We can say, well, we say that Bergen County or Morris County or Sussex County is either suburban, urban, or exurban, and look at the vote totals in there and make comparisons. Or we could look at exit pollsters, and we know that exit polls are actually a private enterprise where randomized precincts are selected and people are grabbed as they walk out of the polling booth, and so we got to have a sense of where those precincts are and make determinations about how people vote. In the 1950s, really the sort of birth of the sense of the suburbs in America, the suburbs were about 3% more Republican than the urban areas, and obviously about a third of the electorate, as I stated earlier. As you move into the 1960s and 70s, the suburbs became a little bit more Republican, about 4 or 5% more Republican in their presidential voting patterns. And the 1980s was the most distinctive time for suburban politics, where during the Reagan and first Bush election, you have about an 8% difference, with the suburbs being more Republican than the urban areas. Bill Clinton's 2 elections retracted that somewhat, so there's about a 5% gap between the suburban vote and the Republican vote. How this works in New Jersey is we could look at a number of ways. This is one way, and this is, if this looks to you like sort of a rainbow spaghetti pattern thrown at a screen, you're not far off. Trust me, this is better than my first version, which had all 21 counties up there. I took a look and said, that's too many. So what I did is just look at a select number of counties that present a contrast. It's like, let me give you a cue as to which counties we're talking about. The dashed line is a statewide number, which depicts the proportion of us that voted for the Democratic presidential candidate or the Republican presidential candidate, starting on the left with the Kennedy-Nixon race in 1960, going through our last presidential election between John McCain and Barack Obama. The 2 most Republican counties are at the bottom there, Ocean and Sussex, and I just arbitrarily picked the most Republican counties this last presidential election in 2008, though as you see there has been some year-to-year movement between that. But if you look at Hudson and Essex, these are the most Democratic 2 counties in New Jersey. And I don't think that you will be too surprised to learn that Hudson and Essex are also our 2 most densely populated counties. Hudson County has more than 13,000 people per square mile, and Essex has about half of that. Ocean and Sussex are an order of magnitude sparser. So the chances of you bumping into another human being, in other words, is just dramatically less likely in less populated counties. And so Ocean and Sussex, Ocean County has less than 800 people per square mile, and Sussex County has less than 300 people per square mile. And these are not accidentally our 2 most Republican places. So this is sort of a bivariate, or just a comparison of 2 attributes of counties: how many people live per square mile and how they vote. And the other sort of take-home message I want you to see from this is the relative stability over time of that relationship. What I mean by this is you'll notice that Hudson and Essex don't bounce around going more Republican than the sparse counties. Their relative rankings between density and vote choice remains relatively stable as we go from the middle of the 20th century through the previous presidential election. I felt it was adding too many bubbles, but if you're looking for those remaining 2 lines that haven't been labeled, that's Camden on the high side and Warren County on the low side, the yellow. I'm a little afraid the colors didn't come quite through as I'd hoped, but I hope that those characterizations are sufficient. The take-home message, even if this is not immediately visually appealing, is that relative stability over time, where the most densely populated counties have remained our most Democratic counties, and our most sparsely populated counties are our most Republican. Another way we can examine how Republican or how democratically leaning our counties are is by looking at, sorry, not our counties, but our voters are, is looking at exit polls. If you look at the last 2 presidential elections and examine the nationwide exit polls that were conducted on election day, we'll see a bit of a resurgence in the partisan differences between urban areas and suburban areas. As the exit pollsters determine that comparison, and that's an important point I'm going to hit later, as other people have determined what suburban means and what urban means, in 2004, John Kerry did about 7 points worse in the suburban areas compared to the urban areas. And Barack Obama did, even, the contrast was even higher, did about 10 points worse in the suburbs than he did in the urban areas. Other scholars have looked at this question of does place matter, and I don't want to make this sound too much like an academic paper where we get bogged down in lit reviews or anything like that. The 3 principal sort of sources for this, Juliet Gainsborough is an author who's examined, especially in the 1980s, suburban voting, looking at polling and determining, after controlling for other forces, education, income, race, and ethnicity, that the suburbs actually do engender some kind of Republican leaning in voters. Seth McKee and Darren Shaw looked at suburban voting across the same time period, looking at national polls, and tracked the same phenomena that I mentioned earlier, where you see the suburbs being a little more Republican than the urban areas. And that's especially true in the 1980s, less so a little bit after, less so a little bit before. Thad Williamson has looked at sprawl, looking at nationwide county data and looking at county-level population density, using a minority of the most heavily populated counties in the United States, finds that the more that you have population inflow and outflow on a day-to-day basis, i.e. commuting, drives more Democratic vote share than you'd expect otherwise in the same places that share the same attributes, the things that we understand drive outcomes. We know that richer counties are likely to be more Republican. We know that counties with more blacks and Latinos are more likely to be Democrat. Controlling for those forces, more commuting flows, Williamson finds, drives more Democratic voting. But I've still not answered my essential question, which is sort of what are the suburbs? How can we measure these in an intellectually satisfying way? And I guess I don't mind piercing the barrier here. Let me ask you, what are some of the one-word answers, please, what are some of the attributes that you think of when you think suburbs? And what I want you to think of is, imagine a anthropologist from an alien extraterrestrial race that secretly flew down here and is doing a little study of us from an anthropological or political study, and notices that some places we humans live close together and some places we live far apart. What are some of the attributes of suburbia that you think this extraterrestrial anthropologist would find? Yes, sir. Wealth, meaning higher in the suburbs, lower in urban areas. Okay? Higher affluence. What else? A little louder for me? More densely populated. People live closer together. Absolutely. What else? Race. In what way?
African-American, Hispanic, white.
The ratios are different. In other words, as you move farther into suburbia, the more likely you're going to find whiter communities. More color when you have more density.
Geography.
What do you mean by that? Geography, you said.
The Hudson and Essex County, I guess, they're closer to New York, so where more people live closer together. I guess in rural areas like Sussex is more farm, kind of, not necessarily farm, but they live spread out.
I'm gonna read your mind for a second. You're thinking, when I log onto Google Maps, that satellite imagery is just a lot more wide open when I'm looking at those 2 bottom counties than I'm looking at those 2 counties. Absolutely. The sort of physical spaces are radically different. That proximity to New York, that other thing you mentioned, radically different.
Education.
Education levels different between the two. A little more higher education levels in the suburbs than the urban areas on average. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. What do you mean? More cars. Absolutely. I was waiting for that one, and I have an image ready for you right here. Congratulations. This is an image of Los Angeles, of course, that maybe is an embodiment of this the sense of sprawl. And I'm going to commit a bit of an intellectual sin here by making those two terms synonymous, sprawl and suburbia. And that might be a flaw in the logic here that I want you to keep me honest with. But all these attributes that are mentioned here are interesting differences between urban areas and suburban areas, and they're absolutely the case. So if these are all true, if we find that higher levels of education, higher levels of affluence, different racial and ethnic compositions within the counties are what explain county-to-county differences in vote share, then this talk is going to be very boring. I will be done. In other words, if we can attribute the differences between suburbia and the city with just what political scientists call compositional differences, meaning that people in these places are composed of different kinds of people, well, this isn't going to be a very interesting talk, because we already know that, for example, blacks in this country, they don't vote 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 for Democrats, they vote 9.5 out of 10 for Democrats. So it's not terribly interesting to conclude that the suburban areas are more Republican simply because there's fewer people of color. So what I want to do is transcend that difference and look at not composition of the suburbs, but the context of the suburbs. What are the, if you take the people out of the counties for a second and just imagine the lay of the land, the human environment in which we live in without the humans, that structure, that context, transportation, the cars, the highways, the imagery you see here is meant to evoke that. Early explanations for the suburbanization of America are things with which you're probably already familiar. This is a group of self-selected people who are avoiding density, avoiding traffic, avoiding crime, avoiding the general hurly-burly of the urban city, seeking lower taxes, and perhaps more racial ethnic homogeneity in their community or in their schools, looking for political autonomy from the urban area so they can set their own school or local political rules. These are early explanations for the suburbanization of America, starting as early as we've had suburbs. Roughly, our attention to this is the 1950s. Bless you. So I want to spend the rest of my time today, and please remind me. Okay, Colleen, remind me where we, so I don't. You're good. Okay. I don't want to go over. The rest of my time today, I want to talk about the importance of these compositional, these contextual forces over the compositional forces. But I want to be very careful. I'm not saying that geography causes people to vote one way or the other. Geography itself is a tough thing to make into what political scientists call an independent variable or a causal influence. In other words, the latitude and longitude, where you live. Sitting here in Madison, I just drove down from Mahwah. I went through a lot of different geographies. Where we live does not directly influence. The soil on which you stand, the air in which you breathe does not have a political influence on you. But it is a vehicle through which other forces are woven. So we don't think of geography as an independent cause of these things, but it is a vehicle through which we can see contextual forces influencing how you vote in presidential elections. So the sort of tests that this study is intended to evaluate is look at a few forces for understanding how suburbs vote beyond that compositional definition that we've worked out. One, density. Does the population density of an area, aside from its compositional attributes, influence whether a place is more Republican or more Democratic? Sometimes we refer to density as sprawl. or location as opposed to region. But as one of you noted a second ago, and as this image is meant to evoke, suburbia is also defined by that sense of suburban being a bedroom community for an urban center. A whole lot of New Jersey every day wakes up and transports themselves to one of the 5 boroughs of New York City for employment. A huge number. I'm confident every one of you knows people that do this. New Jersey is perhaps a peculiar place in that respect. It's a bit of a paradox that New Jersey is simultaneously the most densely populated state in the Union, yet it doesn't really have big cities. The biggest cities we have in this state are less than about 250,000. I mean, that's smaller than Madison, Wisconsin. But we are a big state tucked in between 2 really big urban areas, and so we serve as a bedroom community. Benjamin Franklin, famously said that New Jersey is a valley of humility in between 2 mountains of conceit, and that he said that a long time ago. But perhaps you can imagine the prescience of that comment. But it's certainly the case that a lot of people live in communities here in New Jersey, but transport themselves. So another key attribute of what defines suburbia is the proportion of a community that wakes up and works in Manhattan or one of the other 4 boroughs. So the proportion of a community that commutes is the other defining characteristic of suburbia that I want to test the relationship between commuting percentage and voting proclivities. Within that commuting subset, we can imagine that we can measure this in a couple ways. The number of people who transport themselves, but we can zoom in a little closer and look at other contextual factors. We can imagine that people go to the city through different mechanisms. Some of them drive in. Some of them take public transportation. And another constraining force is distance. Here in Madison, it's a much tougher voyage to get yourself to Penn Station than it would be if you lived in Union City. Distance is a real force. And so we're also going to look at the distance between the urban area and the suburbs as a defining characteristic to see if that has a role in imagining how people vote. Past analyses of suburbia has done great work in establishing how suburbanites vote. In other words, looking at the people themselves. But the shortcoming of looking at polling or asking people individually during exit polls is that you're looking at people. And that is a fantastic unit when you want to know how someone voted. But it makes it very difficult to measure those attributes that I need to know about, which is how dense is where you live. And unfortunately, we as citizens, when you sort of go through your normal life, perhaps you go to go and vote and then are probed by someone who's an exit pollster, or maybe that your phone rings and someone from Peter's outfit is trying to discern what you think politically. Well, you are not able to report to the pollster the exact density of your community. You're going to answer whether you live in a relatively urban area, a relatively suburban area. It's very difficult to measure the things I need to through polling. And so rather than examine individuals, my study looks at ecological data, places. And to do that, I have, this was one of the reasons why New Jersey, I was talking to Ken Green about this before the talk, New Jersey makes a great case for studying this very phenomenon. And I'm afraid those colors are a little off, so I have a backup here where I just go black and white. The lighter areas are places that trend more Republican, and the darker areas are places that trend more Democratic. And these 566 municipalities in New Jersey make fabulous data for this question. We've got a lot of them, 566. They're all very small with rare exceptions. And we have good election data and good demographic information for each of them. And they're exhaustive. You can't live outside these 566. They're the equivalent of counties in other states. So if I have a list of 566 municipalities in New Jersey, I know how all people in New Jersey voted. So New Jersey makes a great case from a data perspective. It also makes a great case from a suburbanization perspective. If you want to study suburbs, you want to hunt where the ducks are. this is a very good pond. I'm going to focus on the 370 municipalities that comprise North Jersey. Now, I moved here in 2005. I am not a native. I had to use my GPS to find you guys today. I still have a tendency to want to pump my own gas. There's a lot of, I haven't quite assimilated. And if I start, I'm going to try very hard not to mention any municipalities' names because I pronounce them incorrectly more than I pronounce them correctly. So, like Hohokus, I'm learning that one. That's one of my favorites now. I'm going to look at the 370 that comprise North Jersey. And please, I do not want to start any debates about the definitional difference between North Jersey and South Jersey, the existence of a Central Jersey. I'm going to go by someone else's completely arbitrary definition, which is I'll look at Nielsen. They set where the media markets are, and so I'm just going by basically the places that are served by the New York City media market rather than the Philadelphia media market. So I'm looking at North Jersey defined by someone else. So if you don't like the way I'm dividing Jersey, I will give you the phone number for Nielsen. New Jersey also presents a good case because there's a clear demarcation between the urban center and suburbia. It's called the Hudson River. It is a very clear definition. That one of the things that makes studying suburbia a little tricky is, well, where does this begin and where does this end? In New Jersey, that margin is clearer, and so another reason it makes New Jersey a good place to conduct this study, or at least as a first cut. So how do we measure the partisan proclivities of New Jersey? You can ask people, and in polling, of course, we ask this question about partisan identification. Do you consider yourself more psychologically bonded to the Republican Party, the Democratic Party? Because I'm looking at ecological data, I don't have the ability to sort of look at attitudes towards parties. I'm going to go simply by how the presidential vote was in these municipalities. And I don't want any one particular election to be too analytically heavy. And so what I do here is simply take the average of the 2004 and the 2008 presidential elections as a barometer of how Democratic and how Republican these municipalities are, 2008 and 2004. Why presidential elections and not statewide races or congressional races or local races, county politics? Well, I want to avoid any sort of hometown or home county biases. If I use Senate races or gubernatorial races, one would expect that Livingston, New Jersey, might be more prone to vote for Chris Christie because of some kind of hometown effect, right? Presidential elections are more immune to that internal New Jersey politics, so it's a more neutral venue than lower turnout races. I mean, I don't know if you voted in yesterday's election, but we had one yesterday. If you were one of that 10% of 12% of the population that voted, I can't use those kinds of low salience elections. Not enough people participate. So presidential elections are the best way to measure a town's Republicanness or Democraticness. I'm measuring some other things, though, and that is these contextual measures of how a community is either urban or suburban. If I just simply classified them the way the pollsters did, urban, suburban, rural, that is extremely coarse, right? It's a very rough measure. It's a trichotomous or a three-point scale. It would be more analytically helpful if we had something that was a quantitative scale, something that where we could measure along a much broader yardstick that had a lot more ticks on it. And so we can imagine that density was the one I led off with as a causal influence on the way people vote. Density, measured simply by the proportion of people who live in a square mile, can show us, using density, we can see suburbia and see whether there's a relationship between how people vote. Well, this is what New Jersey looks like in terms of density, where lighter shades of color there indicate more sparsely populated areas, and the dark areas are, of course, the more densely populated areas. And I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you if you've been in New Jersey for more than 5 minutes. This is where the people live in that corner, and this is up as you travel northwest and travel to the west, the population gets sparser as you move towards Pennsylvania. Commuting, that other essential attribute of what is suburbia, is a slightly different pattern. Using the 2000 census, the 2000 census asked people, where do you work, as well as where you live. And so we know exactly where people live and work and can aggregate that upward and look at the municipal level where people go. And so I looked at every municipality in New Jersey and counted how many people work in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City and took that as a proportion. Darker areas are places where a higher proportion of the population gets up and goes to work every day in New York City. And not surprisingly, the general trend is that proximity means darker areas, but not as clear. You see some other areas that are farther away but higher commuting. Why might that be? Why is proximity and commuting not a perfect shade? Time dependent on what?
Well, the shorter the time. In other words, if you can travel at 70 miles an hour and you can live twice as far away, it's still good.
Exactly. Highways aren't, universally connected. We know that there are smart ways and less smart ways to get to the GW Bridge or the Holland Tunnel or the Lincoln Tunnel, right? And they follow a path. And people live in places, if they live in the city, where it's easier to commute and get to to get to the city. And so people live in towns with train lines. People live in towns that have easy access to the Turnpike or 80 or the Palisade Parkway or the Garden State Parkway. Places that feed into the path that gets to the GW or to the tunnels. And so that's why you see some towns that are farther away from New York City have higher commuting rates. This is a depiction of the relationship between density within a municipality and their voting habits. If you look across the horizontal axis, the x-axis, as you move from left to right, you're looking at towns that are more densely populated. So places that have a much more urban area, much more multiple unit housing, and where lots of people live in a smaller space are going to be on the right-hand side, and places that are far more rural, far more sparsely populated with more farms and exurban area are going to be on the left-hand side. The vertical axis, up and down, tells you how they voted, where places that are up voted more for Obama and Kerry, places that are down voted more for John McCain and George W. Bush. And I've coded them by color. I don't know if that color is coming across very well, but places that had more Bush and McCain voters than Kerry and Obama voters are coded red, and vice versa for blue. And as social scientists like to say, this is a good relationship as far as trying to find results. There's a clear pattern. If there were no relationship between density and voting, it would just look like an arbitrary splatter, as if I just had a handful of dots and just kind of chucked them at the screen. But this forms a pattern. You see a relatively cohesive line of municipalities traveling from the Republican arenas of somewhere in the 30s. As population density increases, it starts to jump upward as that density ramps up. So we have an initial evidence that density and voting have a strong relationship. Let's look at commuting rate. Same idea, where as you move from left to right, the proportion of a municipality or a borough or a town where you live, the proportion of that getting up in the morning and working in New York City increases as you go to the right. And you might be very surprised you might have expected that that's going to go from like 0 to 10. Look at that. That's a percentage. Look at the share of towns in North Jersey that have a fifth of their population leave every day and work in a different state. I think that's incredible. I'm not from New Jersey, so maybe I'm the only one impressed here, but that is a massive, to me, flow of humans on a daily basis for economic reasons. And so to me, this is why one of the reasons I'm doing this study is just the sheer number of people that are doing this. Does this have an impact on the way people vote? And this is a less compelling pattern, but one nonetheless. What you see here is approximately an increase of, let me say this, let me back up a second. For every 1% increase in a town's commuting rate, you have about somewhere between a 0.25 and a 0.5 increase in Democratic voting. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's per percent. So in other words, if I say that by adding an order of magnitude, for every 2.5, or for every 10% shift, moving a tick on that screen, for every 10% shift, that means a 2.5% shift in voting in that town. That's huge. If you were a campaign manager, moving a town 2.5%, you can't buy that amount of advertising. That is a big change in a town's voting proclivities. How about distance? How about that structural reality that some towns are closer or farther from the urban areas? Now, I told you at the beginning I was thanking the people who worked on this project, and they probably didn't know what they signed on for, but one of the sort of tasks that I delivered was I need them to come up with a smart way to measure how far away every municipality in New Jersey is from New York City. Well, that's easy. You could just look it up, right? Well, you couldn't use Euclidean distance, right? Like as the crow flies. As you say, that doesn't tell you anything about how long it takes to get somewhere. Okay, well, you could just simply use MapQuest or Google Maps or something to plot that out as to how many miles going on a route. Well, if I do that, of course, Google Maps will tell me it only takes about 20 minutes to get to Manhattan from here, right? Not the case. We need time and traffic, and so my undergraduate research assistants said, let's use, Google Maps says, based on, I think, if you have an Android phone, you're silently telling Google how slow or how fast traffic's going in the area, in New Jersey and New York area. So Google could actually tell you, like, in traffic, how long stuff takes. And so they did an overtime average of how long it takes to get from each town to, I arbitrarily chose Penn Station as sort of a center of New York City. And so on the x-axis, that's the number of minutes it takes in traffic to get from a municipality to Penn Station. As you see, as the distance increases from Manhattan, the Republicanness of the town increases. Conversely, as you get closer to New York City, towns become more Democratic. To speak in empirics and numbers, for every minute longer, you're going to get about somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2% more or less Democratic. 1 minute. So it doesn't take many minutes to move a town 1%, 2%, the vote share. So looking at these comparisons between population density, the percentage of a town that is commuting, and their proximity to the city, we see 3 pieces of evidence that show us there must be a relationship. What I haven't done yet is do showing you analysis that looks at how these attributes influence voting in the towns, putting those other important characteristics of municipalities in the mix. As you guys were, firing back at me about what are the characteristics of suburbs, we know suburbs are whiter. We know suburbs are richer. We know suburbs are more educated. We know suburbs have higher residential property values. And those things we already know have a relationship on how people vote. So what we need to see is that these key defining attributes of suburbia, ceteris paribus, other things being equal. So I ran a few quantitative models that are sensitive to a geographic kind of analysis. And it's probably not appropriate for the middle of the talk, but I'd be happy to answer questions about running this kind of quantitative analysis, because it is not your ordinary sort of statistical model, because in a normal statistical model, each person is sort of randomly drawn from the population and hence independent. Our units are not independent. They're sitting right next to each other or they're farther away. And we would expect that towns that are right next to each other share attributes. And so you need a statistical model that is able to be sensitive to that spatial proximity between your cases. And so I'm happy to answer questions about how that works because it's absolutely necessary to correct for that spatial proximity among your cases. So what happens when you test these influences when you throw that other stuff that matters into the mix? And so what I've thrown up here is a visualization of the proportion of the vote that moves because of those three attributes that I lined up. So I looked at a town's percentage that have a bachelor's degree as a measure of how well educated. I looked at the percentage of the town that is white and the percentage of town that is black as a measure of race and ethnicity. And I also looked at the median income of that town and the median home value in that town to control for affluence in that town. As you know, richer communities, richer people are more likely to vote Republican than less affluent ones. Those aren't on here because they go by a different scale. What I wanted to put up here was an apples to apples comparison, so I only put up the ones that go by percentages. So you can see with your eyes what you can compare the effect of commuting to other things that you already know have an impact on vote share in this state, in this country. I'm sorry, I forgot about age. The proportion of a town that is 65 years and older is my metric for age in a town, and some towns are younger on average than others, and so you need to control for that. So what do these bars indicate to you? Blue bars that are pointing to your right, are towns that are influences that are pushing towns more towards Democratic voting. Bars that are pointing to your left, like, that was kind of dumb. I should have had them point the other way, going left and right. You live, you learn. Sorry. Imagine turning that in your head, but the red still means more Republican. So pointing that way means more Republican, pointing that way means more Democratic. You are probably not surprised that towns that have more African Americans are more likely to vote for Democrats. That is a strong relationship that we already knew about, but it's now being compensated for. The percentage white is not terribly meaningful as far as predicting how towns vote when you throw the black percentage in the model. More educated actually points towards more Democratic voting when you control for how rich they are. I'm sure the Democratic Party would love to read that more college education, more smarts points you towards the Democratic Party. I'm not trying to join to their talking points, but that's just simply the empirics as I see them here. Age, the older the town is, more likely to point towards Republicans. But right here at the bottom is the contribution that I feel is what I'm trying to add to this discussion about understanding the suburbs. As you move to less densely populated places, you're seeing a lot more Republican voting. But that is mitigated by how many people get up and go to the city every day. So as we flip out away from the city and go to communities that are farther away from New York City, you're going to gradually run into more and more Republicans. True. However, in that community, the more that get up and schlep their way to New York City every day is going to mitigate that powerful suburban sprawling relationship. I tried other measures of suburbanness that are, in my mind, intellectually within that measure of suburbanization. I looked at the transport time, as I mentioned, and I also tried looking at whether a town has a New Jersey train station in it. They did point towards more Democratic voting and mitigated that density relationship only if the other things weren't being involved. In other words, the commuting variable, that proportion of a town that is getting up and going to the city every day soaks up that variance. In other words, it's a better explanation of how people vote than whether there's a train station in town. And that's probably intuitive to you. You've probably driven by train stations that look like they haven't been used in a few years. Some train stations have high usage, some have low. So the mere presence of a train station is a poor indicator of commuting. So the implications of this study at this preliminary stage, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions and answers, because as you see, I came with a pencil and my 2 ears, because I'm looking forward to your questions and suggestions. The implications, as I see them going on from here, is that my evidence says to me that context in politics, where you live, matters beyond the compositional, the composition of a town. Whether there's more black people, more white people, more Latino people, more rich people, more educated people in a town, we already knew that stuff matters. Once we control for those things and look at how many of them go to the city every day, that still has an influence on whether or not a town votes for Democratic. The more people that commute to New York City, the more Democratic. I also think that that is a defining attribute of suburbia. What makes suburban life exist? Being a bedroom community is one of the defining attributes of the American experience of suburbia, and that, in my mind, is a very interesting finding, that the key attribute of what defines suburbia actually chews into the Republican voting tendencies of suburbia. What I can't tell you is exactly why that is. I want you to imagine 2 hypothetical people that live in New Jersey. One of them perhaps decided to take a job in New York City and found out that they couldn't afford housing there, and so decided to find housing in New Jersey. They've chosen a life where their occupation and the rest of their sort of intellectual, political, sociological baggage comes with them in the city, the center of sort of their identity as they perceive themselves, and they self-select into communities that have high commuting rates because of the facile journey. In other words, they're self-selecting into this life. Imagine another hypothetical person that is perhaps more dispositionally conservative, a more Republican voter, maybe a fence sitter but leaning Republican, and they get a job in the city and find that they are going back and forth from New York City. Does the urban area have an influence on them? In other words, is there a socialization effect? Is the day-to-day going to and from the city with its higher heterogeneity, the grand variety that is the urban area, running into more people of color, more ideas, more of everything that you're going to find in a much more homogeneous suburbia? Does that influence people's politics? Maybe that's true too. Maybe they're both true to some degree. So I can't use these ecological data. We can't look at town level data and come up with an answer to that. They might be working in tandem, they might be working across purposes, but my data don't allow an answer to that. Maybe supplementing this with individual level data would. I'd also like to take this to a newer direction where, as I mentioned at the beginning, that New Jersey's among the oldest set of suburbs in America. Would this still work in Houston or Phoenix or San Antonio or Los Angeles or other Sun Belt cities where there's been a tremendous proliferation of suburban growth of the kind that New Jersey went through 2 generations ago? So those are the directions I'd like to go. I understand that for the first time, Ben Bernanke took questions yesterday. So I think it would be entirely ridiculous if I did not take questions. If Ben Bernanke is going to take questions, I definitely should. But please let me remind you before I do that you guys are taking a class on the politics of New Jersey. I've never taken that class, and I can't pronounce these names, so I will do my best to answer these questions. But please, thank you for the opportunity to allow me to share my research with you. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Yes, thank you for coming today, and I will start off the questions. From what I gathered is that the further away you get from the city, the more Republican you get, and that effect gets mitigated by how many commuters there are. So are people that do not commute and have jobs close to home more likely to vote Republican?
My answer to that would violate what political scientists long ago came up with the ecological fallacy error, meaning it's hard to infer individual level behavior from aggregate statistics. Now, I've been doing that all day. I've already been committing that sin, so I don't think I should stop now. I think that logically that has to be the case, that if a town that is not commuting, if the proportion of commuters is driving a town more towards Democrats, that tells me that less commuting is going to mean that the compositional forces are going to remain. So that density is not being mitigated by the commuting, hence more Republican voting. So I would certainly say yes.
What I was curious about is if you checked or not whether the statistics you found for New Jersey in terms of distance away from the city, if that held to other states, if the findings were similar.
I have done an initial stab at Connecticut. And the trouble is the results were not as strong, but pointed in the right direction. But far fewer people commute from Connecticut to New Jersey, and so it was only true in that very southwest county for the communities there. The farther northeast I got a lot more Democratic voters because, well, you're just getting deeper and deeper into New England. So whatever it is that makes New England a lot more Democratic, meaning that there's other compositional influences going on there, are going to drive a different engine in a different place. So my RAs, hopefully as we speak, are putting together Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is another case where you have a major urban area sitting astride a state line. The St. Croix River divides Wisconsin from Minnesota. So if I can see the same sorts of patterns there, and it's working both for the Wisconsin commuters that go into Minneapolis and the Minnesota commuters that are going into Minneapolis, then I can see that state lines aren't driving this train. And then the criticism you might have that, hey, that's just a New Jersey thing. New Jersey's unique here, is less valid. If I can extrapolate these findings to have them work in the same urban area that cross state lines, I think I'll shore up my ability to withstand that criticism. That's an excellent question, Dan.
I'm wondering if you think that the kind of work that people do when they go into the city also affects how much this socialization process takes on them. I mean, I have an uncle, he goes into the city and he works with disadvantaged youth. He's like a mental health counselor, and he's, chicken or egg. I'm not sure it's chicken or egg, but he's very passionate about those sort of issues. I'm prone to say that he'd have a different opinion if he handed out tickets all day and got yelled at by New Yorkers. What do you think?
I cannot, pretend that other stuff doesn't make a much bigger impact on the way people vote. If you told me, I'm sorry, was that uncle or father? I forget. Uncle. If your uncle, if you said Wall Street banker, as opposed to, social services, social work, something like that, those things are going to have a dramatically larger influence on someone's vote proclivities than, that shape who they are much more so than these commuting flows. So these contextual things are sort of working at the margins, and the kind of, you said chicken and egg, that there are much bigger chickens and much bigger eggs out there for determining how people vote that are going to matter more than commuting context. So I feel like I'm trying to make a contribution to understanding suburbia, but I will not pretend that there's other bigger stuff that goes out there. So yes, commuting has an effect, but where you went to college and how much money you make and the kind of work that you do, you guys are at an age when your sort of partisan and ideological proclivities are congealing, they're coming together, and that's going to be with you for the rest of your life. We know that partisan loyalties are something that stays constant over time. And so I'm talking about moving at the margins, for context. So that other stuff would influence voting much more than whether he hops train and moves at work at the city.
How you doing? I have a question as far as education is concerned. In recent times, you have this influx of students in the state of New Jersey having it more easy to obtain a degree. To some extent, becoming more the state being overly educated. It's my opinion. But in terms of that, do you see...
we're in the business of educating, right?
I do.
Okay.
So I know. But do you see that rise in people having degrees in education do you see that aiding towards a rise in commuters, New Jersey commuters moving, or a rise in commuters from New Jersey to New York or other large cities?
Oh, I mean, that's kind of a future prediction, and it's an excellent. I mean, it's really one of the most important questions as to where our economy is pointing in the next 5-10 years. Let me answer a sort of very related question, which is, what does the influence of more people with education have? I'm going to go to commencement in a couple of weeks, and one of the most striking things about going to commencement today is at Ramapo College, where I teach, there's going to be about 1,200 graduates. 800 of them are going to be women. 800 of 1,200 are going to be women. Who's graduating from college and how many is having all kinds of transformative effects on American society and American politics. If a lot more of us are getting bachelor's degrees, right now approximately a little bit more than a third of the sort of voting age population has a bachelor's degree. As that number increases, any sort of look at how much this has an influence on politics is going to water down a bit. So as far as the politics go, I'm probably not the right guy to ask about whether that has an impact on, macroeconomic or, the kind of jobs they're going to get. One hopes, at least I should be on record as saying a college education should have an influence on later life prospects. As far as how this relates here, though, the more people that have a bachelor's degree in these towns, if that's increasing in the aggregate, that's going to sort of decrease the uniqueness that has and the uniqueness of its influence on political outcomes.
You mentioned that you were looking into Minnesota because it was like the same city but two different groups of people. Have you ever thought about just looking at South Jersey because it's the same people but two different cities?
I have, and what I don't have it's next on my docket. New Jersey is a fantastic place for studying presidential elections. If you want to look at the sort of influence of campaign advertising, right? Because South Jersey actually sees ads because they're in the Pennsylvania media market. So presidential candidates who are trying to capture Bucks County and the swing counties around Philadelphia, well, there's going to be collateral damage to that advertising that spills over into South Jersey, where North Jersey folks are in the New York City media market, where it's way too expensive to persuade the 14 people who could be persuaded in this media market.
Hi, thank you for the enlightening speech. Theoretically speaking, let's say that a suburban district was combined with a rural district. How do you think that would affect voter turnout, and what effects would it have on electoral races in general?
Like if we took two and politically erased the line between them?
Right, yeah, pretty much. And combine, let's say maybe a Republican district with a Democratic district, and see how it plays out.
What you're suggesting is sort of tantamount to artificially, homogenizing two places. So it would do nothing to my results from a kind of quantitative angle, because you'd be moving two cases that were here to here and merging them right in between each other. But I think inside your question is that, well, what if you sort of moved a person, and transplanted them to a different context? And I guess then I'd have to say that context would matter. If you transplanted someone, not instantly, not overnight, but because I think there's a difference in the way that social, political context people live influences their voting, I would have to say, yes, there is influence. Now, if you believe the self-selection argument I made at the end, where you say that, no, the only differences you're seeing here, Teigen, are because people choose to live in these places because they work there, then it's more of a self-selection explanation and not one that context is influencing their politics. Good question.
Okay. Do you think, you said that age has something to do with it in a lot of cases. Do you think, or do you have any research that shows that having a family or being married has anything to do with it? Because a lot of people come to the suburbs for family reasons, because they'd rather live in a nice suburban house with their picket fence than live in the city.
Just got one of those. Didn't come with the picket fence.
That's very unfortunate.
Yeah. I thought it was issued at the door. I thought like the realtor would hand me the picket fence, but no. Do life cycle events like marriage, kids have an influence on politics? The answer is gender dependent. There's virtually no difference between married men and single men and their voting preferences. Women, there's about a 3% difference. In other words, married women are a little bit more Republican than single women controlling for other stuff. Maybe the women in this room are raising an eyebrow here, but maybe internally chortling, going, yeah, I think I knew that marriage had more an effect on me than it did on him, right? So life cycle events do have an impact. I don't know if that's part of my equation, though. I'd like to think that the density, it seems so clinical to say population density, so I'm glad you've added the flavor of, that's a single family dwelling house as opposed to an apartment building, and that's going to have a difference in the way people bump each other at the hall, and that interaction might engender, the kind of, community thinking that might lead to more democratic voting. So, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about, is that kind of context where you live in either a single family dwelling versus an apartment building is exactly what I'm talking about. Excellent question.
I'd like to thank you for coming today.
I'd like to say you're welcome for inviting me.
And that's the conclusion for this Public Mind series.
You've been a pleasure. I'm glad I could serve as the anchor man in your leg of guest speakers here this semester.
I'd like everyone to give our speaker a nice round of applause. Comment.